Welcome back everyone. Today I want to talk to you about a subject that I see a lot of photographers struggle with, and it is if they should choose a landscape or a portrait orientation when they're choosing a certain scene. And I'm making this video because I think I found a pretty good workflow to figure out which one you should choose. So what we call a picture in a landscape orientation is basically any picture whose width is greater than its height. These kinds of images tend to have quite a lot of context on them and oftentimes have a bigger sense of distance, and the individual subjects are therefore more pieced out. A photo in a landscape orientation is obviously called that because it just lends itself to show a big part of the landscape, especially in comparison to a photo in a portrait orientation. Vice versa, the portrait orientation is basically any picture whose height is greater than its width. These kinds of images tend to be a little more intimate or feel a bit more intimate because it's more focused on the specific subject rather than the greater scene. Of course, the name comes from the fact that this orientation is usually used to shoot pictures of people, aka portraits. These kinds of images usually make the subject seem a bit more grand, as if the purpose of this image is to show more detail of a specific person or the subject. Because you're cutting away quite a lot of context on the sides of the image, people looking at this image are usually more drawn to what you're trying to lead the viewer's eye to. Alright, now let's get to my workflow. I basically have 3 steps that I use to figure out if I should use the portrait or the landscape orientation. My first step in this workflow is, of course, figuring out what the main subject is supposed to be. In this picture you can see it's shot in Portugal and there's huge cliffs, and the main subject in this picture is supposed to be, well, the cliffs and also the waves, the big waves crashing against those cliffs. And I just wanted to show the magnitude of these cliffs. I actually left a couple of people there to show the magnitude and how tall these cliffs actually were. Yeah, and it's very obvious in this picture, like, this is supposed to be the main subject, and that's the first thing you have to figure out. So once you have figured that out, you come to the second step of this workflow, which is you have to figure out how the scene around the subject you are taking would influence the scene, and how much of that you want to show and how much you maybe want to hide. Because maybe there's a lot of detail, for example in the picture I just showed you, the little people that basically show how tall the cliffs actually are. Just wanted to show that detail, but maybe you also want to hide some detail. For example, I have another picture here, which is a lighthouse that I shot in Mallorca. And as you can see in the foreground, I had a lot of people commenting on the foreground because they thought it was clouds or something like that, but it's basically just somewhat V-shaped rock formation that I shot through. It was on purpose because I wanted to invoke some curiosity, and obviously that worked out. So the third and last step in this workflow would be to figure out, in relation to where you're standing, how much of the foreground and the subject and the sides and everything you actually want to show. I have another picture here that I actually took in Germany. And in these pictures I purposely shot it in a portrait orientation because I wanted to completely negate the sides. It was actually a picture where you had, or a scene where you had like a huge rock formation, but I only wanted to show that one rock with the bird on top. I also completely negated the foreground. I was actually standing quite far away from it. So not just the portrait orientations and landscape orientation, you also had to figure out like in what focal length you had to shoot it. And was rather long focal length. Can't really remember which one anymore. But yeah, that also went into my thought when taking that image. Of course, even though we call these photography techniques rules, they aren't baked in stone, and you don't have to use them to shoot great images, or at least you don't have to use them all the time, because you can actually shoot great images even though you're not using them. So just take it with a grain of salt. You don't always have to apply it, but it may actually help you in your workflow to figure out which orientation you want to shoot in. But yeah, it's not something you have to use all the time. Just to show you what I actually mean by that, I'm going to show you an image also from Mallorca, from actually the same subject as the same lighthouse I showed you earlier. But this image, I actually wanted to show the foreground a bit. It was not from the same spot I was shooting the other picture from. It was a bit to the side, a couple of meters. And in this picture I want to show you the entire coastline, how it's leading up to the main subject, the lighthouse. But the lighthouse, even though it's the main subject, it's not the only subject. I wanted to show the entire coastline. And I tried shooting it in a landscape orientation, but it just didn't work out. So even though like all the steps I took, 1, 2, 3, basically told me to shoot it in a landscape orientation, I still went with a portrait orientation. I think it works way better. So yeah, even though it's photography rules, they aren't back in stone. You don't always have to use them. And lastly, something that is a bit easier is when you try to use this workflow to figure out in what orientation you want to shoot, but it just doesn't work out. As the picture I just showed you, there is an even easier step that doesn't take into consideration all the steps I told you. So sometimes it's better to use the aforementioned workflow, but this step or this technique is basically just shoot a horizontal subject in a landscape orientation and shoot a vertical subject in a portrait orientation, for example a tree or a tower, or as I just showed you on the picture, the shoreline with the main subject, the lighthouse. I shot it in a portrait orientation because it just fit better on the image. And then lastly, there's the example where you neither shoot the landscape nor the portrait orientation, and this is when you shoot a square format image. I use this from time to time, and most of the time when I use it is because the workflow is pointing me towards both directions. I could shoot it in either landscape or a portrait orientation, and I just can't really figure it out. I'm just going to show you an example. It's an image I think I shot last winter or a year before, and my main subject is the tree in the front, but the main subject is the branches that have snow right on them. And usually, as I mentioned earlier, if I shoot a tree, a subject that is standing vertically, I would shoot it in a portrait orientation, but as the main subject, the twigs where the snow is on, is they're in a horizontal orientation, I just shot in a square format, and I think that works out quite well. Alright, this is it from me for today. I hope you liked this little tip video. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you'd give me a thumbs up. If you have any thoughts, improvements, whatever, let me know in the comments down below. I'd be curious to hear about them. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel. That's it from me for today. Have a good one. Bye.